You don't miss people. You miss the version of yourself you become when you're not alone. That's why silence hurts more than heartbreak. Because when no one is watching, there's nowhere left to hide. And if you've been filling every quiet moment with someone else just to feel okay, what happens when the noise finally stops? What if the reason this season feels empty is because it's the first time your life has enough space to grow? I want you to really sit with this for a moment. The reason being alone hurts so much isn't because something is wrong with you. It's because being alone removes the distractions that were protecting you. You know that feeling. When the day slows down, when your phone is quiet, when there's no one to text, no one to explain yourself to, no one to perform for, and suddenly there's this heaviness in your chest, like something unfinished has caught up with you. We've been taught to call that loneliness, but that's not the full truth. Think about it this way. If silence was the enemy, monks would be the most broken people on earth. If being alone was dangerous, solitude wouldn't be practiced by the wisest minds across history. So why does it feel unbearable for you? Because for most of your life, connection hasn't been about sharing love. It's been about escaping discomfort. I remember reading a study where people were left alone in a quiet room with nothing but their thoughts. No phone, no music, no distractions. Some of them preferred giving themselves a mild electric shock rather than sitting in silence. That's not because humans hate solitude. It's because solitude removes the noise that keeps us numb. When you're alone, you don't just lose people. You lose validation. You lose distraction. You lose the version of yourself that was shaped by how others saw you. And that's terrifying because when there's no one watching, you're forced to meet the parts of you that never got attention. The unmet needs, the suppressed anger, the quiet sadness you've been carrying without language for it. So you start thinking, why do I feel like this? What's wrong with me? Why does everyone else seem to have someone? But here's the uncomfortable truth. No one says out loud. The pain you feel in solitude isn't proof that you're failing. It's proof that something inside you is waking up. Most people never stay alone long enough for that moment. They jump into the next relationship, the next talking stage, the next friendship that fills the silence. Not because it's right, but because it's familiar, and familiarity feels safer than growth. But what if the emptiness you feel isn't emptiness at all? Space for clarity, space for truth, space for a version of you that isn't shaped by being needed, chosen, or approved of. Right now, being alone feels like rejection, but it's not. It's separation from noise, from patterns, from identities that were built to survive, not to thrive. And I know this part hurts. I know it feels uncomfortable and exposing and unfair, but there's a reason your life feels quieter right now, and it's not because you're losing something. It's because something real is about to begin. Write part 1 of the script, approx. 400 to 500 words, tone instructions. Intimate and empathetic. Speak directly to you, e.g. I know you feel lonely right now. I know fluff. Every sentence must add value. Avoid generic motivators, like just believe in yourself. Give specific psychological insight. Storytelling. Use phrases like, I remember reading a study, or think about it this way. Format. Write in spoken word format. Not too short. Not too long sentences. Easy to read. No headings. I want to talk to you about what happens after the silence stops feeling so loud. Because this is the part no one prepares you for. At some point, being alone stops feeling like punishment and starts feeling like information. You begin to notice patterns, not in other people, but in yourself. Think about it this way. When you're always around someone, your nervous system is constantly adjusting to them, their moods, their expectations, their approval or disapproval. So your instincts get muted. But when you're alone long enough, those instincts come back online. I remember reading a study about decision fatigue and self-trust. Researchers found that people who spent intentional time alone before making major decisions were significantly more confident in their choices later, even when outcomes were uncertain. Not because they predicted better results, but because they trusted themselves more deeply. That's the quiet gift of solitude. It reconnects you to your internal compass. You start noticing when something doesn't sit right, when a message feels off, when an invitation feels heavy instead of exciting. And instead of ignoring that signal, you respect it. This is where your boundaries stop being rules you force and start being instincts you honor. You stop asking, will this make them leave? And start asking, will this cost me myself? That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Because once you've learned how to be alone, you no longer stay in situations that require self-betrayal. You don't explain your worth. You don't negotiate basic respect. You don't shrink to fit into someone else's comfort. And here's the part that might surprise you. This doesn't make you colder. It makes you clearer. I've seen this in people who took intentional periods of solitude after long relationships. At first, they feared they were becoming disconnected, but over time, their relationships actually improved. They listened better. They chose more carefully. They stopped mistaking urgency for intimacy. Because solitude teaches you the difference between loneliness and longing. Loneliness says, I need someone to feel whole. Longing says, I'm whole and I desire to share. That distinction matters. When you don't know how to be alone, you reach for people to soothe pain. When you do know how to be alone, you reach for people to share joy. And that's why your standards rise naturally, not out of arrogance, but out of alignment. You stop tolerating half effort. You stop romanticizing inconsistency. You stop calling anxiety chemistry. Think about how many times you stayed because the connection was intense, even though it wasn't safe. Solitude rewires the attraction system. It teaches your body what calm feels like. I remember another piece of research that changed how I saw this. People who spent regular time in reflective solitude showed lower cortisol levels in relationships, less fear-driven behavior. They didn't need constant reassurance because they had internal reassurance. That's thriving. Thriving isn't being busy. It isn't being surrounded. It isn't being desired by many people. Thriving is being able to sit with yourself on a quiet night and not feel the urge to escape. It's trusting your pace. It's choosing depth over noise. And yes, being alone will cost you some connections. Not because you're withdrawing, but because you're no longer available for dynamics that depend on your self-abandonment. Some people will fall away. Not because you failed, but because the version of you they knew no longer exists. And I know that grief can feel confusing. You can miss people, even when you know leaving was right. That doesn't mean you made the wrong choice. It means you're human. But here's what I want you to hear clearly. The version of you that learns how to be alone becomes unshakable in ways you can't yet imagine. You stop chasing. You stop settling. You stop asking for permission to be yourself. You become someone who doesn't need to be chosen because you've already chosen yourself. And when connection comes, real connection, it doesn't feel urgent or anxious or fragile. It feels steady. It feels mutual. It feels safe. That's why you don't just survive when you're alone. You train, you heal, you become someone who can love without losing themselves. And that's the kind of thriving that lasts. I want to slow this down now because this is where everything comes together. When you learn how to be alone, something subtle but powerful shifts in the way you relate to the world. You stop asking people to fill emotional gaps they were never meant to fill. And that changes how connection shows up in your life. Think about it this way. When you're hungry, you'll eat almost anything. When you're nourished, you choose with care. Solitude does the same thing for your emotional system. I remember reading a study on relationship satisfaction that found something unexpected. People who reported the highest levels of contentment weren't the ones with the most social interaction. They were the ones who felt emotionally complete before they connected. They weren't seeking rescue. They were seeking resonance. That's the difference solitude creates. You stop entering relationships with a silent request, please make me feel okay, and instead, you enter with clarity. Let's add to what's already whole. This is why thriving alone isn't about rejecting love. It's about redefining it. Love stops being a place you hide from yourself. It becomes a place where you're fully seen. And here's something important to know. Once you've built this inner stability, you'll notice resistance from the world around you. Some people will be uncomfortable with your calm. Your boundaries will feel unfamiliar to those who benefited from your overgiving. Your silence will be misunderstood as distance. That doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It means you've changed the contract. I've seen this happen again and again. People who learn how to be alone stop reacting immediately. They pause, they respond instead of appease. They don't rush to explain themselves, and that pause is powerful. Because in that pause, you give yourself the respect you used to hand out freely to others. I know part of you still worries that if you don't chase, you'll be forgotten. If you don't reach out, you'll be left behind. If you don't stay available, you'll lose connection. But think about it honestly. Did chasing ever make you feel secure? Did overextending ever make you feel chosen? Or did it just teach you to abandon yourself quietly? Solitude interrupts that pattern. It teaches your nervous system that love doesn't require urgency. That connection doesn't have to hurt to be real. That peace is not boring. It's safe. And from that safety, you begin to build a life that fits you. Your routines reflect your values. Your relationships reflect your standards. Your time becomes intentional instead of reactive. You stop asking, why am I alone? And start asking, what am I creating? Because this season isn't about isolation, it's about integration. You're integrating who you are when no one is watching with who you are when people are around. And that's the version of you that thrives. Not because you have more people, but because you have more presence. So if you're alone right now and it feels unfamiliar, uncomfortable, or quiet in ways you're not used to, don't rush to escape it, stay. There's nothing missing here. You're not behind. You're not broken. You're becoming someone who can finally stand on their own and invite others in. Not to complete them, but to share the ground they've learned to hold. And that changes everything. I want to leave you with something honest, not comforting, but grounding. There will be days when being alone still hurts. Not because you're regressing, but because growth doesn't erase your humanity. I remember reading a long-term study on emotional resilience that followed people over several years. What stood out wasn't that the strongest individuals stopped feeling lonely. It was that they stopped panicking. When loneliness showed up, they understood the feeling as temporary information, not a permanent state. That's the real shift you're building. Think about it this way. Weather changes, but climate is what lasts. Your emotions are weather. Your relationship with yourself is the climate. When you know how to be alone, a lonely moment doesn't threaten your identity. It doesn't send you searching for proof that you matter. It doesn't push you into the arms of something familiar but harmful. You sit with it. You listen. You let it pass. And that ability is rare. Most people live in reaction. They react to silence. They react to distance. They react to the fear of being forgotten. You're learning to respond instead. That's why life starts to feel different in subtle ways. You don't rush decisions. You don't cling to people who can't meet you. You don't mistake attention for care anymore. You begin to trust your own rhythm. And here's something important to understand. Thriving alone doesn't mean you won't want companionship. It means companionship becomes a choice, not a requirement. I've seen people reach this point and worry something is wrong. They feel calmer, less dramatic, less desperate for intensity. They mistake peace for emptiness. But peace isn't numbness, it's regulated presence. Your nervous system has learned a new baseline, one where love doesn't come with fear, where silence doesn't feel like abandonment, where your worth doesn't rise and fall based on someone else's availability. That's not something you lose once you've built it. And from this place, relationships change, not because you demand more, but because you accept less chaos. You show up honestly. You listen without anxiety. You leave when something consistently harms you without needing to prove a point. That's strength. If there's one thing I hope you take with you, it's this. Being alone didn't shrink your life. It expanded your capacity. It taught you how to hold yourself in moments when no one else could. It showed you that your presence is enough to ground you. It gave you a sense of belonging that doesn't disappear when someone walks away. So if this season feels quiet, let it be quiet. If it feels unfamiliar, let it teach you. If it feels uncomfortable, let it reshape you. You're not waiting for life to begin. You're building the foundation that life will stand on. And when connection comes, whether soon or later, it will meet a version of you that knows who they are, what they need, and what they will no longer abandon themselves for. That's not loneliness. That's self-trust. And that's why you don't just survive alone. You thrive.